So good afternoon, class. Welcome back to the environmental science lecture. So last week we started with environmental problems, their causes and sustainability. So we mostly looked at how environmental problems arises whenever there is any change in the four life support systems of the earth, that is the lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere and the biosphere. And we identified that there are four major causes of modern environmental issues. That is population growth, unsustainable resource use, poverty, and excluding the market prices of goods and services from environmental costs. Then we learned about the importance of natural capital, and then we started learning how overpopulation impacts the environment, especially with respect to the tragedy of the commons. Then we learned about ecological footprint, what are the components of ecological footprint, what is biocapacity, what is bioproductivity, what is ecological deficit, what is ecological reserve. Okay, then how we have been overstepping ourselves for the past 40 years, then what is the earth overshoot day, how we calculate the earth overshoot day, how the date of the earth overshoot day has actually changed in 2020 because of the pandemic, and what we learned from the pandemic and so on. So then we learned about overconsumption with special respect to this IPAT model. Okay, so today, and then we also learned about the how affluence is also responsible. That is how affluence has both harmful as well as beneficial impact on the environment. So today we will be continuing the same discussion, but today we will first start with poverty. Let's see how poverty also gives rise to environmental problems. Now, when we talk about poverty, first and foremost, what you need to understand is that poverty occurs whenever people are unable to meet their basic needs for adequate food, water, shelter, health, and education. So, according to the World Bank, at least 1.5 billion people, that is one out of every five person on the earth, live in extreme poverty, and they struggle to live on the equivalent of less than 100 rupees a day. Now, the good news is that the number of people living in extreme poverty has actually decreased by 500 million since 1981. Okay, but still, the number of people living in extreme poverty is significantly high. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand that poverty and environment, they are closely interrelated. Okay, and people living in extreme poverty, they are actually seldom the principal creators of environmental damage. Okay, but they are the first people to feel the or bear the brunt of environmental damage, and are therefore often caught in a downward spiral. Okay, so as a result, the poor are forced to deplete resources to survive, and this degradation of the environment further impoverishes them. So when this self-reinforcing downward spiral becomes extreme, then what happens? These poor people, they are forced to move in increasing numbers to marginal and ecologically fragile lands or to cities. Okay, so poverty actually has a number of harmful effects and harmful environmental and health effects. See, first and foremost, the daily lives of the world's poor. They are actually focused on getting enough food, water, and cooking and heating fuel to survive. Okay, so they do not have the luxury to think about the environment. So desperate for short-term survival, what they do, some of these individuals, they degrade forest, soil, grasslands, fisheries, and wildlife at an ever-increasing rate. So they do not have the luxury of worrying about long-term environmental quality or sustainability. Okay. So even though the poor in developing countries have no choice but to use few resources per person, but their large size, that is their large population size, leads to a high overall environmental impact. And many of the world's poor people, they die prematurely from preventable health problems. So one such problem is malnutrition from a lack of protein and other nutrients that are needed for good health. Okay. So their resulting weakened condition can actually increase their chances of death from normally non-fatal diseases. And a second problem is the limited access to adequate sanitation facilities and clean drinking water. So more than 2.5 billion people today have no decent bathroom facilities. So they are forced to use their backyards, ditches and streams. And as a result, a large portion of these people, almost 1 out of every 7 in the world, they get water for drinking, washing and cooking from water bodies which are already polluted by human and animal feces. And finally, a third problem is severe respiratory disease that people get from breathing the smoke of open fires or poorly ventilated stoves which they use for heating and cooking inside their home. Okay, so what you need to understand here is that the poor people or the poor people living in extreme poverty, they are not the principal creators of environmental problem, but they are the first set of people to bear the brunt of environmental damage. Okay, because uh, most of the time when there is degradation of resources, they are in fact forced to deplete resources for their survival, and this degradation of the environment further impoverishes them. And when this self-reinforcing downward spiral becomes extreme, so then people are forced to move in increasing numbers to marginal and ecologically fragile lands or to cities. Okay, so next we will be talking about excluding environmental costs from the market price of goods and services. So what do we mean by that? See, first and foremost, when companies are using resources to provide goods for consumers, okay, but they are not required to pay for the harmful environmental costs of supplying such goods. For example, say fishing companies. Fishing companies, they are paying the cost of catching the fish, but they never pay for the depletion of fish stocks. Similarly, timber companies. The timber companies, they are paying the cost of clearing, cutting forests. Okay. Uh, the timber companies, they are paying the cost of clear cutting forest, but they never pay for the resulting environmental degradation and loss of wildlife habitat. So see, the primary goal of these companies is to maximize profit for their owners or stockholders, which is how capitalism works. And in fact, it would be an economic suicide for these companies if they add these costs to their products unless government regulations create created an even economic playing field by using taxes or regulations to require all businesses to do so. So as a result, the prices of goods and services do not include their harmful environmental costs. So consumers have no effective way to evaluate harmful effects on the Earth's life support systems and on their own health resulting from production and delivery of the goods and services they buy. Okay. And another problem is that governments give companies tax breaks and payments called subsidies to assist them with using resources to run their businesses. So this helps to create jobs and stimulate economies, but it can also degrade natural capital again because the value of the natural capital is not included in the market prices of goods and services. So indeed, environmentally harmful or perverse subsidies encourage the depletion and degradation of natural capital. Okay. Now, apart from these major causes of environmental problems, another reason why we have environmental problem is because people have different views towards the environment. Okay. So people disagree on how serious various environmental problems are and what we should actually be doing about them. So these conflicts arise mostly out of differing environmental worldviews. So that is how people think the world works and what they believe their role in the world should be. Okay. So part of that perceived role is actually determined by a person's environmental ethics. Now, what is environmental ethics? So environmental ethics is basically what one believes about what is right and what is wrong in our behavior towards the environment. Okay. So people with widely differing environmental worldviews can take the same data, be logically consistent, and arrive at quite different conclusions because they start with different assumptions and values. Okay. So what you see in this slide is basically the summary of the four major beliefs of each of these three, or each of the three different major environmental worldviews. Okay. So the first worldview that we have is basically the planetary management worldview. So planetary management worldview is basically a human-centered worldview, which is held by many people. Okay. So according to this view, humans are the planet's most important and dominant species. And we can and should manage the earth mostly for our own benefit. Okay. So other species, which includes both plants and animals and parts of nature, they are actually seen as having instrumental value based on how useful they are to us. So according to this view, human well-being depends on the degree of control that we have over natural resources. Okay. And as the world's most important and intelligent species, we can also redesign the planet and its life support systems to support us and our ever-growing economies. Okay. Then another human-centered worldview is basically the stewardship worldview. Now, the stewardship worldview assumes that we have an ethical responsibility to be caring and responsible managers or stewards of the earth. So, according to this view, as we use the earth's natural capital, we are just borrowing from the earth and from future generations. So therefore, we have an ethical responsibility to pay this debt by leaving the earth in at least as good a condition as what we now enjoy. Okay. So some people believe that any human-centered worldview will eventually fail because it wrongly assumes we now have or can gain enough knowledge to become effective managers or stewards of the earth. So critics of human-centered worldviews, they point out that we do not even know how many species live on the earth. So much less what their roles are and how they interact with one another and their non-living environment. Okay. And finally, we have actually uh, an earth-centered worldview, which is we called as the environmental wisdom. So some people actually think that we should go beyond focusing mostly on species. So they believe we have an ethical responsibility to prevent degradation of the Earth's ecosystem, biodiversity, and the biosphere. So this Earth-centered environmental worldview is actually devoted to preserving the Earth's biodiversity and the functioning of its life support systems for us and other forms of life now and in the future. So people with earth-centered worldview, they believe that humans are not in charge of the world and that human economies and other systems are actually subsystems of the biosphere. So they understand that the earth's natural capital keeps us and our other species alive and supports our economies. So they argue that preserving the Earth's natural capital actually requires mimicking nature by applying the various principles of sustainability to human economies and lifestyle. So According to this environmental wisdom worldview, we are part of and not apart from the community of life and the ecological processes that sustain all life. Okay, so therefore, we should work with the planet to promote environmental sustainability instead of trying to conquer and manage it mostly for our own benefit. So in many respects, it is opposite of the planetary management worldview. Okay. So this worldview actually suggests that the earth does not need us managing it in order to go on, whereas we need the earth in order to survive. Okay. So what we need to save is the existence of our own species and cultures, which have been around for less than an eye blink of the Earth's 4.5 billion year history, and other species that may become extinct because of our activities. Okay. So what we have understood so far is that there is widespread evidence and agreement that we are a species in the process of degrading our own life support system, and that during this century, this behavior will threaten human civilization and the existence of up to half of the world's species. So part of this problem stems from ignorance about how the earth works, how our actions affect its life sustaining systems, and how we can change our behavior towards the earth. So correcting this begins by understanding three important ideas that we have seen so far. So first is natural capital matters because it supports the earth's life and our economies. Okay. Second thing that we saw is that our ecological footprints are immense and are expanding rapidly. In fact, they already exceed the Earth's ecological capacity. And the final thing we learned is that the ecological tipping points, they are irreversible and should never be crossed. So once we cross such a point, neither money nor technology will save us from harmful consequences that could last for thousands of years. So basically, learning how to live more sustainably requires a foundation of environmental education, which is aimed at producing environmentally literate citizens, which is why we are having this course. So now there are several solutions which we can adopt in our day-to-day lives to reduce our ecological footprint. For example, we can rely more on renewable energy resources. We can increase energy efficiency. We can buy locally grown food. We can reduce our meat consumption. We can reduce, reuse, recycle, and so on and so forth. Okay. So there are several options that are available to us, which we should look up seriously, or which we should contemplate seriously to reduce environmental problems. Okay. Now, next, what we will be learning today is about sustainability and sustainable development. So far, and you often hear this term sustainability, sustainable development, and all. So now what we will be learning is what is sustainable development, from where did this concept of sustainable development came into existence, how we can achieve sustainable development, and so on. Okay, so that will be the second part of this lecture. So what we have seen is that overall development of humanity over the last decades has actually led to increasingly unfavorable climate changes and natural disaster. Okay. But it has also led to wars and political and socio-economic instability. So through their action, humans have actually negatively impacted on the environment, endangering the survival of the earth and the future generations. So these conditions have actually indicated changes in the behavior aiming towards rational and efficient management of all resources that will allow less pressure and environmental impact. So such responsible behavior that will ensure the long-term exploitation of resources without jeopardizing future generations is considered as sustainable development. Okay. So sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Okay. So the concept of sustainable development is based on the concept of development, that is socio-economic development in line with ecological constraints. It is also based on the concept of needs, that is redistribution of resources to ensure the quality of life for all, and the concept of future generations, that is the possibility of long-term usage of resources to ensure the necessary quality of life for future generations. Okay. Now, from the definition of sustainable development, you can understand that the essence of the concept of sustainable development implies a balance between three pillars of sustainability. That is environmental sustainability, which is focused on maintaining the quality of the environment, which is necessary for conducting the economic activities and quality of life of people. Social sustainability, which strives to ensure human rights and quality, preservation of cultural identity, respect for cultural diversity, race and religion, and economic sustainability, which is necessary to maintain the natural, social, and human capital required for income and living standards. Okay. So complete sustainable development can be achieved only through a balance between all these three pillars. Okay. However, the required condition is not easy to achieve. Because see, in the process of achieving its goals, each pillar of sustainability must respect the interest of other pillars, not to bring them into imbalance. So while a certain pillar of sustainable development becomes sustainable, others can become unsustainable, especially when it comes to ecological sustainability, on which the overall capacity of development depends. Okay. So now let's see from where this concept of sustainable development came into existence, or how sustainable development concept came into action. See, the impact of growing population, okay, and our civilization on the environment and resources of the planet. So this was first identified by a demographer and political economist of England. He was none other than Thomas Robert Malthus. So Thomas Robert Malthus, in his essay on the principle of population in 1798, he stated that the world's population would eventually starve, or at the least live at a minimum level of subsistence, because food production could not keep pace with the growth of population. So he also wrote that population, when unchecked, increases the geometrical ratio and subsistence for man in an arithmetical ratio. Okay. Now, with technical advancement, whatever he said, it was proven wrong. So, as Green Revolution, which has initiated improvised farming techniques, the invention of new farming equipment and advances in agricultural science, all this resulted in the rapid production, reducing the food prices than it was 200 years ago, okay, or even 50 years before. But availability of the environmental resources were still the issue. So to address this issue, what happened was international and national organizations started working on several levels. And as part of this, many national and international level initiatives, the concept of uh, needs, particularly the vital needs of the world's poor, who were identified to be prioritized. And secondly, the idea of restrictions forced by the state and social organization on the environmental environments carrying capacity for present and future needs. Okay, so what happened thereafter was in the following year. Okay, so in later in 1972, there was actually a conference that was held. Okay, so this was the first conference which was focused on discussing the necessity of focused on discussing the need of the future generations, or what could be the most important solutions, or how we can meet the resources of the poor people. So what you see in this picture is Mrs. Indira Gandhi then. So this is basically the 1972 Stockholm Conference. Okay. So in the Stockholm Conference, he singled out that the priority should be given to the poor people to meet their needs and so on. And based on the Stockholm Conference, what happened was this World Conservation Strategy was developed. Okay, so this World Conservation Strategy thereby gave rise to the Brundtland Commission, which was led by the World Health Organization back then. So they came up with this Our Future Common Future report, in which the first definition of sustainable development came into existence. Okay, so in this, as I said to you, the concept of needs, particularly the vital needs of the world's poor, were identified and prioritized. Okay, and the idea of restrictions forced by the state and the social organization on the environment's carrying capacity for present and future needs was also prioritized. Then in June 1992, what happened was the first United Nations Conference of Rio de Janeiro on Environment and Development took place. And here they accepted a schedule for environment and development for the 21st century. So the Rio Declaration, which is Agenda 21, and the Commission on Sustainable Development, they were the key outputs of the conference. So the Earth Summit was thus concluded with a clear and openly accepted concern on sustainable development by the major global leaders, making this an international agenda for all. So even though there was a common consensus on working towards sustainable development principle, but there was disagreement about its meanings and implications. So in September of 2000, building upon a decade of major United Nations conferences and summits, world leaders they came together at the United Nations headquarters in New York to adopt the United Nations Millennium Declaration. So the declaration actually committed nations to a new global partnership to reduce extreme poverty and set out a series of 8 time-bound targets with a deadline of 2015. So these came to be known as the Millennium Development Goals. Now the Millennium Development Goals were a set of 8 objectives developed and set forth by the United Nations in the year 2000 following the UN Millennium Summit and the United Nations Millennium Declaration of the same year. So every member nation at the time, okay, committed to play a part in helping achieving the goals by the year 2015. Now, during that time, what happened was progress was not uniform across the world. Okay, so with some countries making a big stride and others making little to no progress across the 8 goals. So, of course, it is also debatable as to what extent the creation of the MDGs themselves led to the progress that was seen. So, in 2015, to continue spurring global collaboration towards a better world, the United Nations revamped the framework by introducing the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so the Sustainable Development Goals are basically a set of 17 objectives set forth by the United Nations in 2015 to define the global development agenda for the next 15 years until 2030. So by endorsing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs in 2015, the world community reaffirmed its commitment to sustainable development. Okay. So through this agenda, 193 member states, they pledged to ensure sustained and inclusive economic growth. social inclusion, and environmental protection, fostering peaceful, just, and inclusive societies through a new global partnership. So the 2030 agenda is universal, transformative, and rights-based. So it is an ambitious plan of action for countries, the United Nations system, and all other actors. So the agenda is basically the most comprehensive blueprint to date for eliminating extreme poverty, reducing inequality, and protecting the planet. So contrary to what you may believe, the SDGs actually do not represent the agenda in its entirety. So they are not a summary of the agenda, but rather focus areas necessary to achieve sustainable development. So the 17 goals should be seen as indispensable pieces in a big and complex puzzle. So in order to truly understand the agenda, what you need to is you need to look at the puzzle as a whole, but at the same time, it is also impossible to complete this puzzle without these pieces. So SDGs are basically the pressure points that have the capability to affect the well-being of the entire planet and the people who live on it. Okay. So because the SDGs are the result of extensive political negotiation and individual consultation, they are not perfect, but inarguably represent some of the most urgent and universal needs of the world today. So the SDGs actually help translate the core values and principles underlying the agenda into concrete and measurable results. And see, not all the goals actually have the same standing. So some goals appear more overarching or final in nature, while others can be seen as means to those final goals. Say, for example, we do not only pursue the water and energy goal, that is SDG 6 and 7, for their own sake, but because clean water and energy, they are means to the true goal of health and well-being. Okay. However, clean energy and water are such crucial issues that they demand specific focus. Okay, so now let's quickly look into each of these goals in a little detail. So the first goal is basically deals with ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. So yes, of course, this is a very ambitious goal, but it is believed that we can do it. In fact, in 2000, the world committed to halving the number of people living in extreme poverty by the year 2015, and we in fact met that goal. However, more than 800 million people around the world still live on less than 100 rupee a day. So that's about the equivalent of the entire population of Europe living in extreme poverty. So it is time for us to build on what we have learned and end poverty altogether. Okay. Goal 2 is basically about ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition. So in the past 20 years, hunger has actually dropped by almost half. So many countries that used to suffer from famine and hunger, they can now meet the nutritional needs of their most vulnerable people. So of course, it's an incredible accomplishment. But what we have to do now, we have to go further and end hunger and malnutrition once and for all. So that means doing things such as promoting sustainable agriculture and supporting small farmers. So it's a tall order. But for the sake of the nearly 1 out of every 9 people on earth who go to bed almost hungry every night, we have to try. So you need to imagine a world where everyone has access to sufficient and nutritious food all year round. So together we can make that a reality by 2030. Then goal 3 is about good health and well-being. So we all know how important it is to be in good health, isn't it? So our health affects in everything from how much we enjoy life to what work we can perform. So that is why there is a goal to make sure that everyone has health coverage and access to safe and effective medicines and vaccines. So in the 25 years before the SDGs, we made big strides. Okay. So We prevented child deaths, so preventable child deaths dropped by more than half. Then maternal mortality, it went down by almost as much. And yet some other numbers, they remain tragically high, like the number of children who die before their fifth birthday, or that AIDS is still the leading cause of death for adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. So today we have the means to turn that around and make good health more than just a wish. Okay. Next is quality education. That is, we need to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. See, first then foremost, what you need to know is that, see, poverty, armed conflict, and other emergencies keep many kids around the world out of school. So in fact, kids from the poorest households, they are 4 times more likely to be out of school than those of the richest households. So now what we need to do is, like, see, since 2000, there has been enormous progress on the goal to provide primary education to all children worldwide. Okay, the total enrollment rate in developing regions has actually reached over 90%. So by measures in any school, that's a good grade. So now what we need to do, now we need to get an even better grade for all kids and achieve the goal of universal primary and secondary education, affordable vocational training, and access to higher education and more. Okay. Then goal 5 is about gender equality. So uh, what we need to do is, like, see, we can celebrate the great progress that we have made today in becoming more prosperous and fair. But there is a shadow to the celebration, because in just about everywhere, women and girls, they lag behind. So there are still gross inequalities in work and wages. So lots of unpaid women's work, such as childcare and domestic work, discrimination in public decision making, and so on. But there are grounds for hope. So more girls are in school today compared to in 2000. Most regions have actually reached gender parity in primary education. And the percentage of women getting paid for their work is also on the rise. So this sustainable development number 5, it aims to build on these achievements to ensure that there is an end to discrimination against women and girls everywhere. Then goal 6 is about clean water and sanitization. So everyone on earth should have access to safe and affordable drinking water, which is the goal 6. So while many people take clean drinking water and sanitation for granted, many don't. And water scarcity, in fact, affects more than 40% of people around the world. And that number is projected to go even higher as a result of climate change. So if we continue the path we are on, so by 2050, at least 1 in 4 people are likely to be affected by recurring water shortages. But we can take a new path, that is more international cooperation, protecting wetlands and rivers, sharing water treatment technologies that leads to accomplishing this goal. Then goal 7 is about affordable and clean energy. That is, we need to ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable and modern energy for all. So between 1990 and 2000, the number of people with access to electricity, it increased by 1.7 billion. And that is a progress that we need to be definitely proud of. Yet the world's population continues to rise. So still more people will need cheap energy to light their homes and streets, use phones and computers, and do their everyday business. And how we get that energy is at issue. Okay, because fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions are making drastic changes in the climate, leading to big problems on every continent. So instead, what we can do, we can become more energy efficient and invest in clean energy sources such as solar and wind. So that way we will meet electricity needs and protecting the environment. Okay. Then goal 8 is about promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So an important part of economic growth is that people having jobs that pay enough to support themselves and their families. So the good news is that the middle class is growing worldwide, almost tripling in size in developing countries in the last 25 years to more than a third of the population. But today, job growth is not keeping pace with the growing labor force. So things don't have to be that way, isn't it? So we can promote policies that encourage entrepreneurship and job creation. So we can eradicate forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking. And in the end, we can achieve the goal of decent work for all men and women by 2030. Then goal 9 is about infrastructure, industry and innovation. So that is, we need to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. So technological progress so far has helped us addressing big global challenges such as creating jobs and becoming more energy efficient. For example, today the world is becoming even more interconnected and prosperous because of the internet. And the more connected we are, the more we can all benefit from the wisdom and contributions of people everywhere on earth. And yet 4 billion people today have no way of getting online. Then the vast majority of these people are in developing countries. So the more we invest in innovation and infrastructure, the better off we all will be. So bridging the digital divide, promoting sustainable industries and investing in scientific research and innovation are all important ways to facilitate sustainable development. Then goal A10 is about reducing inequality within and among countries. So this is like an age-old story because the rich is getting richer and the poor is getting poorer. And this divide has never been starker. So we can and must adopt policies that create opportunity for everyone, regardless of who they are or where they are coming from. So income inequality is a global problem that requires global solution. So this means improving the regulation of financial markets and institutions, sending development aid where it is most needed, and helping people migrate safely so that they can pursue opportunities. So together we can now change the direction of the old story of inequality. Okay. Then goal 11 is about sustainable cities and communities. That is, we need to make our cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So more than half of the world's population today live in cities, and that figure will go to about two-thirds of humanity by the year 2050. And cities are in fact getting bigger. So in 1990, there were 10 megacities. So megacities are basically cities with more than 10 million inhabitants. So in 2015, there were 28 megacities. Okay. And a lot of people love cities because they are the centers of our culture and business and life. Now, the thing is, they are also often centers of extreme poverty. So to make cities sustainable for all, we can create good, affordable public housing. So we can upgrade slum settlements, we can invest in public transport, create green spaces, and greater, broader range of people involved in urban planning decisions. Okay, so that way we can keep the things we love about cities and change the things we don't. Then goal 12 is about ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So people, especially in the developed countries, they use a lot of stuff and some people use very little. So in fact, a big share of the world's population is consuming too little to meet even their basic needs. So instead, we can have a world where everybody gets what they need to survive and thrive. And we can consume in a way that preserves our natural resources so that our children can enjoy them and their children after that. So the hard part is how to achieve that goal. So we can manage our natural resources more efficiently and dispose of toxic waste better. Okay, so we can also cut per capita food waste in half globally. We can get businesses and consumers to reduce and recycle waste. We can also help countries that have typically not consumed a lot to move towards more sustainable consumption patterns. Okay. Then goal 13, one of the most important goals, is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. So every country in the world is seeing the drastic effects of climate change. So some countries are seeing the effect more than the others. So on average, okay, the annual losses from earthquakes, tsunamis, tropical cyclones, and food flooding count in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And we can reduce the loss of life and property by helping more vulnerable regions, such as landlocked countries and island states, and so on. So it is still impossible with the political will and technological measures to limit the increase in global mean temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and therefore affect the worst effects of climate change. So this Sustainable Development Goal 13 lays out a way for countries to work together to meet this urgent challenge. Then goal 14 is basically about life below water. So as we know, oceans make human life possible. So their temperature, their chemistry, their currents, their life forms, all these make human life possible. And more than 3 billion people today depend on marine and coastal diversity for their livelihood. But today what we are seeing nearly a third of the world's fish stock has been overexploited, and that is definitely not a sustainable way of life. So even people who live nowhere near the ocean, they can't live without it. Okay? So oceans absorb about 30% of the carbon dioxide that humans produced. But we are producing more carbon dioxide than ever before, and that makes the oceans more acidic. Okay? So our trash is not in fact helping either, because over 13,000 pieces of plastic or litter could be found on every square kilometer of ocean. So this sustainable development goal indicates targets for managing and protecting the life below water. Similarly, goal 15 is basically about life on land, because humans and other animals, they all rely on other forms of life on land for food, clean air, clean water, and as a means of combating climate change. So plant life makes up 80% of the human diet. So forests, which cover 30% of the earth's surface, help keep the air and water clean and the earth's climate in balance. So that's not to mention they are home to millions of animal species. But the land and life on it are in trouble. So arable land is disappearing 30 to 35 times faster than it has historically. Deserts are spreading, animal breeds are going extinct, and we can turn these trends around. So fortunately, this sustainable development goal, it aims to conserve and restore the use of terrestrial ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, drylands, and mountains by 2030. Then goal 16 is basically about peace, justice, and strong institutions. So see, a country cannot develop if its people are that is how can a country develop, or how can people eat and teach and learn and work and raise families without peace? And how can a country actually have peace without justice, without human rights? Okay, and without government based on the rule of law. So some parts of the world enjoy relative peace and justice and may come to take it for granted. So other parts seem to be plagued by armed conflict, crime, torture, and exploitation, all of which hinders their development. So the goal of peace and justice is one for all countries to strive towards. So the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, it aims to reduce all forms of violence and propose that governments and communities find lasting solutions to conflict and security. That means we need to strengthen the rule of law, reduce the flow of illicit arms, and bring developing countries more into the center of institutions of global governance. And finally, goal 17 is about strengthening the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Okay. So see, the Sustainable Development Goals list that we saw so far is a pretty big to-do list. And in fact, it is so big that you might say it's not, uh, it cannot be done. So why we should even try? But we have got a lot going for us. So the world is more interconnected today than ever before. We can because of the internet, travel, and global institution. And there is a growing consensus about the need to work together to stop climate change. And the Sustainable Development Goals are no small matter either, because 193 countries have agreed on these goals, which itself is a pretty incredible thing. 193 countries agreeing on anything. So this final goal 17, it lays out a way for nations to work together to achieve all the other 16 goals. Okay. So now that we have discussed about the all 17 SDGs or the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, what you need to realize is that at the heart of the 2030 agenda are five critical dimensions, that is people, prosperity, planet, partnership, and peace, also known as the five P's. Okay. So traditionally viewed through the lens of three core elements, that is social inclusion, economic growth, and environmental protection. So the concept of sustainable development has actually taken on a richer meaning with the adoption of the 2030 agenda, which builds upon this traditional approach by adding two critical components, partnership and peace. So genuine sustainability sits at the core of these five dimensions. So the five dimensions inform development policy decisions. Okay. So this means that for a development intervention to be sustainable, it must take into account the social, economic, and environmental consequences it generates and lead to conscious choices in terms of the trade-off, synergy, and spin-offs it creates. So additionally, policymakers, they need to ensure that any intervention is developed, owned, and carried forward with the relevant partnership and leverages the appropriate means of implementation. Okay. Next, what we will be seeing is about the international spillovers. So see, to achieve all these 17 sustainable goals, every country has adopted various strategies. Okay. So these strategies need to be implemented domestically without generating or without creating any negative impact on other countries, which we call as spillover. So the score actually measures transboundary impacts generated by one country on another, which undermine their ability to achieve the SDGs. So it covers financial spillover, environmental spillover, and social impact. Okay. So the environmental spillover will be covering international spillovers related to the use of natural resources and pollution. That is to achieve, let's say there are two countries A and B. So to achieve its SDGs, country A should not be polluting the environment in a way such that it impacts the environment quality of country B. Okay, or let's say there is a river that is being shared by both these countries A and B, and to achieve its country SDGs, country A is polluting the river, and all the waste that it is generated is flowing going into the country B, which is located downstream of this river. Okay, so environmental spillover actually talks about such international spillover related to the use of natural resources and pollution. Then economic spillover or financial spillover actually covers international development finance, unfair tax competition, banking secrecy, international labor standards, and so on. Okay, so there should be a clarity about how tax is being levied on its citizens in each country. What is the rationale behind implementing those tax to achieve SDGs? What are the banking policies to achieve SDGs? And then many countries depend on foreign labor for their growth and development. So how those countries are treating these foreign laborers, laws they have, what standard of living they are providing, and so on. And finally, we have the security spillover. So security spillover actually includes negative externalities such as the trade in arms and organized international crime, which can have a destabilizing impact on poor countries. So we know that certain countries are actually involved in arms trade and organized international crime, which impact the peace and justice in other poor countries. So that also should be taken into account when considering the or when calculating the international spillovers. And among the positive spillovers of security spillover are investment in conflict prevention and peacekeeping. Okay, so when we look into the spillover score of various nations, we see that many of the countries like India, China, Argentina, Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, and so on, they have a good spillover score compared to many developed countries like the United States, Qatar, Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Kuwait, Switzerland, and so on. This is what we are trying to implement or make you or what you need to understand from this is that these countries which are having a good spillover score, their actions or their measures to achieve the SDGs is not having much negative impact on the environment or not having much negative impact on the surrounding nations. That is why their spillover score is good. But for many of the Middle East countries, which you can see, they are having a very poor spillover score because they are very much relying on the neighboring countries to meet their needs. Especially, for example, in case of Singapore, where there is no natural resources. In fact, the country relies on water, country relies on other day-to-day products on its neighboring countries. So everything is imported in that country, because of which its spillover score is poor. Okay, but when we look into the SDG score, like how much successful these countries have been in achieving their SDGs, you would be seeing that Sweden is actually having the best SDG score, because Sweden is almost on the track of achieving the 17 SDGs, while when we talk about India, India is still a long way to go. Okay, so there are many more agendas or many more goals that India needs to accomplish, similar to many other countries. Okay, so with this, I actually end this lecture on environmental problems, their causes, and sustainability. So if you have any questions, let me know.